in specific reference to the role played by him in the Second Time of Troubles. No small number of historians, taking up a theme that we already saw Churchill use, compare Stalin to Peter the Great. 881 Even the objection raised in regards to it, Peter, contrary to Stalin, looked to the West and opened up his state to it. 882 doesn't seem persuasive. The condemnation of the Asiatic dispositions, the barbaric, Asiatic measures, and the Asiatic methods, for which the government and bourgeoisie of Tsarist Russia are responsible, is a crucial moment in Stalin's revolutionary agitation. 883 At least until October 1917, he had no doubt that his country was more backwards at all levels in relation to the Western democracies, where bloody pogroms against the Jews don't take place, pogroms that rage in a semi-Asiatic country, supra, ch. 5. 9. After the seizure of power, Stalin not only insists on the need to embrace Western technology, but also declares that, if they really want to live up to the principles of Leninism, the Bolshevik cadre must know how to combine the Russian revolutionary impetus with the practical American spirit. In 1932, still referring to the United States, he expresses his appreciation for their industrial and productive traditions. They are somewhat democratic. 884 The reference to Peter the Great seems to be yet more persuasive in explaining the history of Soviet Russia for the fact that Lenin makes explicit reference to it, and it's referenced by Stalin as well, who once in a while appears to take up the figure of the great Tsar as a model. 885 Trotsky himself, even while denouncing the betrayal of the revolution, writes, in comparison to other various regions and nationalities, regime largely realizes the historic work that Peter I and his comrades realized for Old Moscow. He just does it on a much vaster scale and at a much quicker pace. 886 It's interesting as well to observe that, at the end of his trip to the Soviet Union in 1927, a great philosopher like Benjamin sympathetically shares the thesis by some literati who see in Bolshevism the coronation of Peter the Great's work. 887 Lastly, one could go further back and recall a prediction by Marx, after having mentioned the violent and unprecedented disturbances provoked by the secular contradictions of Tsarist Russia. He concludes, the Russian 1793 will be the second turning point in Russian history and will introduce a real and generalized civilization in place of the false, deceptive civilization introduced by Peter the Great. 888 All that said, while it can in part serve to illuminate the relation between Russian history and the Second Time of Troubles, the comparison in question leaves out the Second 30 Years' War and the extraordinary influence exercised by Stalin at the global level. The condemnation in 1924 of the outrageous disparity between nations, theorized and imposed by imperialism, and the call to topple the wall that separated whites and blacks, nations considered civilized and peoples excluded from that recognition, supra, ch. 5. 7. The approval of a profoundly internationalist constitution, as Stalin stresses while presenting his project, and based on the principle that all nations and races have equal rights, regardless of the color of their skin, their language, and their respective level of economic and military development. All this could not fail to arouse a deep echo not only in the colonies but also in the peoples of colonial origin located in the very heart of the West. 889 In the southern United States, where the regime of white supremacy still rages on, a new atmosphere takes hold. They look to the Soviet Union with hope and to Stalin as the new Lincoln, the Lincoln who would put an end, this time concretely and definitively, to the enslavement of blacks, and to the oppression, degradation, humiliation, violence and lynchings that they continue to endure. 890 While it advances toward autocracy, Stalin's USSR has a powerful influence on the struggle by African Americans against racial despotism. In the South of the United States, a phenomenon is witnessed that is worrying from the point of view of the ruling caste. It's the growing imprudence of black youths. Thanks to the Communists, they finally begin to receive that which was stubbornly denied to them, an education that goes further than the basic education traditionally given to all those destined to carry out semi-servile labor for the master race. Now, however, in the schools organized by the Communist Party in the north of the United States, or in the schools of Moscow in Stalin's USSR, blacks embraced the study of economics, politics, and world history. They also explore these disciplines to understand the reasons for the hard fate reserved to them in a country that carries itself as the champion of freedom. Those who attend those schools go through a profound change. The imprudence they're condemned for by white supremacy is, in truth, their self-esteem, up until that time forbidden and crushed. A black woman, and delegate to the International Congress of Women Against War and Fascism that takes place in Paris in 1934, is extremely impressed by the equality and fraternity there, despite the linguistic and racial differences between those participating in that initiative promoted by the Communists. It was paradise on earth. Those who arrive in Moscow, observes a contemporary American historian, experience a sense of freedom unheard of in the South. A black man falls in love with a white Soviet woman and they get married, even if later, in returning back home, he can't bring her with him, knowing the destiny that awaits in the South for those that are found guilty of the crime of miscegenation and racial bastardization. 891 The hopes of African Americans placed in the new Lincoln are not as naive as they may seem. Let's reflect on the times and the modalities that characterize the end of the regime of white supremacy. In December of 1952, the United States Attorney General sends a revealing letter to the Supreme Court as it debated the question of integrating public schools. Racial discrimination carries water for communist propaganda and raises doubts even among friendly nations about the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith. Washington, observes an American historian retracing those events, would run the risk of alienating the colored races not only in the East and the Third World, but in the very heart of the United States. Here too communist propaganda has achieved considerable success in attempting to win blacks over to the revolutionary cause, undermining their faith in American institutions. 892 There is no doubt, on these events, the concern over the challenge objectively represented by the USSR, and by the influence exercised by it on the colonial peoples and the peoples of colonial origin, played an essential role. Stalin doesn't just indirectly influence democracy in the West with the push in some way given to the process of African American emancipation. The speech presenting the proposed new constitution totally condemns the three great discriminations that characterize the history of the liberal West. It's not income, national origin or sex that must determine political and social placement, but only the personal capacity and work of each citizen. 893 At the time in which he expressed himself in that way, the three great discriminations are still present in different forms and intensities in this or that country in the liberal West. Lastly, in pronouncing himself in favor of the overcoming of the three great discriminations, Stalin also declares that the new constitution is destined to guarantee the right to work, the right to rest, the right to an education and to assure the best material and cultural conditions, all within the realization of socialist democratism. 894 It is the theorization of the social and economic rights that, according to Hayek, represents the ruinous legacy of the Marxist Russian Revolution and that profoundly influences the demands for the welfare state in the West. 895 Let's return to Russia. The reader must have noticed that, in speaking of Stalinism, I make use of quotation marks. The term is used by the present-day followers of Trotsky in relation to the most distinct political realities, for example, to classify the leadership of post-Maoist China. But in even wanting to exclusively refer to the USSR, the term Stalinism is not persuasive. It appears to presuppose a homogeneous collection of doctrines and methods that don't exist. In the 3 decades in which he exercised power, We see Stalin make an effort in elaborating and putting into practice a program of government, making note of the disappearance of the hopes for the worldwide triumph of the socialist revolution and clarifying the difference between utopia, that is the legacy of both Marx's theory and the millenarianism for a totally new world provoked by the horrors of World War I, and the state of emergency, that in Russia takes on an exceptionally long duration and acuteness because of the convergence of the two gigantic crises, the Second Time of Troubles and the Second 30 Years' War, making clear his intention of not putting the Communist Party's monopoly on power up for discussion. Stalin repeatedly seeks to move on from the state of emergency to a state of relative normality, with the realization of a Soviet democracy, of a socialist democratism, and a society without the dictatorship of the proletariat. But those attempts failed. It's significant how the question of succession is handled soon after Stalin's death. The elimination of Beria is a type of mafia-style settling of accounts. It's a personal violence that doesn't make reference to any state or juridical order, nor to party statutes. The comparison between Stalin and Peter the Great now becomes totally unworkable. Looking closely, the Second Time of Troubles doesn't even end with the arrival of autocracy. Its arrival coincides with the start of a new and prolonged state of emergency, that expands first with a dreadful New World War, and later with the Cold War at risk of transforming into a nuclear apocalypse at any moment. One could say that the Second Time of Troubles ends, in fact, with the overthrow of the USSR. Like the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks are unable to adjust to the disappearance or the attenuation of the state of emergency, and they therefore end up seeming obsolete and superficial to the majority of the population. After having managed to overcome the crisis of the entire Russian nation, the Bolsheviks in the end were defeated by the arrival of that relative state of normality, that is itself an outcome of their efforts. It's at the international level, however, that the influence of the October Revolution, and the man who led Soviet Russia for 3 decades, proved to be more solid. One can ridicule the pompous language of a constitution that never came into force, but it's necessary to have in mind that even purely abstract declarations of principles have an impact on history. We can fall back in horror at a scenario that sees democracy, and especially social democracy, advance in the wake of the challenge being offered by a dictatorial regime prone to using terror. But to give into that sort of reaction means, in the last analysis, escaping from the complexity of its historical process. Those who would prefer to have before them a simpler scenario would do well to reflect on an observation by Marx: it's the bad side that produces the movement that makes history. 896